Usually when we talk about a medical diagnosis, there's this expectation of precision, like engineering, right? You break your arm, the X-ray shows that jagged white line, and the doctor just points and says, there it is.
Right. It's totally binary. It's either broken or not broken.
Exactly. It's clean.
Yeah.
And I mean, we naturally apply that same kind of logic to the institutions that manage medicine. We assume that if there's a defect in the system, like a broken policy or a dangerous practice, a threat to patient safety, a frontline worker can just, pull a red cord, the assembly line stops, and the floor manager says, hey, thanks for pointing out the flaw.
And it's a very comforting thought, honestly. I mean, we want to believe that the safety nets we pay for with our taxes and our trust are just perfectly woven, objective, and self-correcting.
Right. But then you step into the world of medical bureaucracy and institutional trauma and regulatory law, and suddenly that X-ray machine is broken, that red cord you pull to stop the assembly line, it turns out it's actually wired to a trap door right under your feet. We're looking at a diagnostic and regulatory landscape today that is just incredibly murky.
It is the absolute definition
Right.
of diagnostic muddy waters.
Yeah.
And, when an institution is forced to choose between admitting a catastrophic systemic failure and destroying the single individual who pointed it out, well, the waters get very dark very quickly.
Yeah, they really do. So today we are untangling a deeply moving, extensively documented, and frankly chilling narrative. It's titled The Hardest Road, The Journey of Dr. Karyali Srivatsa. And I want to speak directly to you, the listener, right now. This is not just about a local medical bureaucracy in the United Kingdom. It is a fundamental question of survival in modern systems. Like, what happens when an institution designed to protect the public decides it? It actually must destroy the person trying to save it.
It's a question that scales from your local walk-in clinic all the way up to global governance.
So what exactly are we examining today? Our stack of sources is massive for this deep dive. We have legal documents spanning a brutal 14-year battle with the National Health Service, the NHS, and the General Medical Council, the GMC, in the UK. We have Dr. Srivatsa's own autobiographical writings, including Tears of Happiness and The Art of Self-Diagnosis. We're pulling from transcripts of investigative documentaries, correspondence, and extensive data from the British Medical Association.
And I think we should set the tone right here at the start. As we go through these documents, this isn't a bitter attack on the medical profession. This isn't some conspiracy theory about shadowy figures in smoke-filled rooms intentionally plotting harm.
Right.
What we are doing today is an anatomical dissection of institutional self-preservation. It is an exploration of medical ethics, moral courage, and just the cold mechanics of bureaucratic survival. It's the story of a physician who lost absolutely everything to defend his patients, and in the aftermath of that total destruction, ended up building a revolutionary blueprint for the future of global healthcare.
It's incredible. And to understand how Dr. Srivatsa ended up facing a retaliatory campaign that literally chased him out of his own country, we have to look at the storm that was brewing decades before he ever filed a lawsuit. Because the documents trace his foresight back to, like, the late 1980s and early 1990s.
Right, the era when he was establishing himself as a highly experienced pediatrician, ultimately spending over 30 years in intensive and critical care.
And his approach to medicine wasn't just, standard textbook stuff. The sources highlight that his entire medical philosophy was grounded in two massive, distinct historical pillars. First, you have the ancient wisdom of Charaka, the foundational Ayurvedic text. Charaka emphasizes prevention, deep observation, and treating the whole person within their environment, not just treating a localized symptom. And the second pillar is the data-driven hygiene legacy of Florence Nightingale.
Which is an incredibly rare synthesis for a modern critical care doctor, to be honest.
Yeah.
You have the holistic intuition of ancient Eastern philosophy paired perfectly with the rigorous statistical, environmental control of Western empirical nursing. Florence Nightingale, she proved that disciplined observation and basic hygiene save lives on a national scale.
Yeah, the Crimean War data.
Exactly. And Dr. Srivatsa took those exact principles and applied them to the microscopic battlefield of the pediatric intensive care unit.
Because he was observing the whole environment, not just the individual patient lying in the bed, he saw a crisis forming 35 years before it hit the mainstream news. The timeline points back to 1989 and 1992. Dr. Srivatsa was warning the medical establishment about the existential threat of antimicrobial resistance, or AMR. He was publishing papers pointing out that the very tools we use to save lives, hospital equipment, specifically intravenous cannulation and endotracheal tubes, were acting as vectors. They were the highways, allowing superbugs like MRSA to spread from patient to patient.
What's fascinating here is the sheer foresight. I mean, in the late 80s, the medical establishment was still throwing parades for antibiotics. It was the golden age of the pharmaceutical quick fix.
Hmm.
But Dr. Srivatsa, looking at the intensive care environment through that dual lens of Charaka and Nightingale, he realized that bacteria were adapting faster than we could innovate.
Let's break down exactly what a superbug is for a second, because we hear MRSA, methicillin-resistant Staphylococcus aureus, tossed around on the news, but the mechanics of it are, well, they're terrifying. Why does a bacteria become super?
It comes down to basic evolutionary pressure. When you flood an environment, like a hospital ward, with broad-spectrum antibiotics, you kill off all the weak, susceptible bacteria. But in any population of billions, a few naturally have genetic mutations that allow them to survive the drug.
Right, survival of the fittest.
Exactly. And by wiping out their competition, you've just handed those surviving resistant bacteria an all-you-can-eat buffet of resources. They multiply. Furthermore, bacteria can actually swap genetic material with each other, a process called horizontal gene transfer. They literally pass the blueprint for resistance to completely different species of bacteria.
Oh, wow, so they share the cheat codes.
That's a perfect way to put it. They share the cheat codes.
So, by overprescribing antibiotics and by using invasive procedures like breathing tubes without absolute perfect environmental hygiene, hospitals were essentially acting as elite training camps for indestructible bacteria.
Yes, and Dr. Srivatsa understood this mathematically.
Let's look at the data from our sources on this post-antibiotic era we are now entering, because it is staggering. The World Health Organization and other models project that by 2050, antimicrobial resistance could kill 10 million people annually.
10 million.
Every single year. And the economic devastation is just as profound. The data suggests this crisis will push over 28 million people into extreme poverty, largely in low-income regions, and cost the global economy upwards of $100 trillion.
100 trillion.
Yeah. If we lose antibiotics, we don't just lose the ability to treat a nasty cough or strep throat. We lose the entire foundation of modern medicine. Routine surgeries, cesarean sections, joint replacements, chemotherapy, all of these rely on the fundamental assumption that we can control post-operative infection. Without antibiotics, a simple scraped knee could become a death sentence again, just like it was before the 1920s.
Okay, so if a critical care doctor is waving a red flag in 1989 saying, hey, the way we're using these tubes and drugs is breeding superbugs, why did the system completely ignore him?
It comes down to how the healthcare system evolved economically, and the sources provide a very sharp critique of this. Over the last few decades, medicine shifted from being patient-centered to being doctor-centered and really institution-centered. It became a highly industrialized profit drain model, heavily influenced by private equity and rigid government efficiency targets.
Right, but what does that actually look like on the ground? Like, how does that stop a hospital from cleaning an endotracheal tube properly?
It's about where the money and the metrics flow. The system is incentivized to extract wealth via high-margin, downstream procedures. Hospital administrators and private equity backers love expensive treatments. Robotic surgeries, complex MRI scans, and chronic lifelong medication management. What they do not love, and what they drastically underfund, are upstream preventive measures. Things like wash water, sanitation, and hygiene.
Because you can't bill a patient for the infection they didn't get.
Precisely. Preventive medicine isn't profitable. Educating a patient so they don't need to come to the hospital doesn't generate billing codes. Ensuring rigorous, time-consuming sterilization protocols slows down the number of patients you can push through a ward in a day. So when Dr. Srivatsa pointed out that the foundational environment of the hospital was flawed, it was easier for the institution to ignore him than to redesign their incredibly profitable, high-throughput machine.
I was thinking about this when reading the notes. It's like we built modern medicine on a single wooden pillar called antibiotics. And while the termites were visibly eating the pillar, the system just kept building heavier and heavier floors on top, celebrating how tall the hospital was getting, completely ignoring the structural engineer screaming from the basement.
That's the perfect analogy.
Yeah.
And they didn't just ignore the engineer, they actively silenced him, because reinforcing the foundation would slow down the construction of the penthouses. The system became dependent on fear-driven overconsumption. They need patients to be anxious, to rush to the hospital for minor ailments, to demand tests and pills. This generates data, it generates revenue, and it infantilizes the patient, creating a culture of dependency.
And that systemic blindness to the looming superbug crisis, that prioritization of institutional throughput over actual healing, is the powder keg. It perfectly sets the stage for the specific, catastrophic policy failure that Dr. Srivatsa would ultimately blow the whistle on.
Because when a system is desperate to cut costs and process more patients faster, without addressing the root causes of illness, they start cutting dangerous corners.
Yes, so we jump forward to 2006. The UK Health Secretary makes a massive policy shift. To cut costs and increase patient throughput in the NHS, they smashed the demarcation barrier between doctors and nurses. They created these nurse-led walk-in clinics where nurses were allowed to diagnose, prescribe medications, and monitor patients entirely without a doctor's supervision.
Now, we need to be very careful and clear here.
Yeah, absolutely.
Nurses are the absolute backbone of healthcare. They are highly skilled professionals who save lives every day. But the diagnostic frameworks, the complex pharmacological training, and the thousands of hours of pathology study required to independently diagnose undifferentiated illness, that is what medical school and residencies are for. By stripping away that supervision, the government was essentially running a massive, dangerous experiment on the public under the guise of efficiency.
I mean, if you've ever gone to an urgent care clinic and felt like you were on a conveyor belt, getting a 5-minute consultation from someone rushing through a checklist, you have experienced the exact environment this policy created. And Dr. Srivatsa, working in a clinic in Surrey, witnessed the devastating reality of this experiment firsthand. The sources detail specific, horrifying clinical errors. There was an instance where a nurse, operating without a doctor's oversight, inappropriately stopped a vital prescribed inhaler for an infant under 1 year old.
Which, for an infant whose airways are already incredibly narrow and vulnerable, is a life-threatening decision.
Yeah. And then there's the case of the rash. A patient presented with a severe rash. A nurse misdiagnosed it as basic eczema. The nurse prescribed topical steroids, which is standard for eczema, but the rash wasn't eczema, it was a systemic issue.
And this perfectly illustrates the danger. If you prescribe topical steroids, what you are essentially doing is suppressing the local immune system to stop inflammation. If the patient actually has eczema, that's fine. But if the patient has a systemic infection presenting as a rash, applying steroids turns off the body's alarm system and immune response in that specific area. It allows the actual underlying condition to multiply and worsen drastically, severely endangering the patient.
It's treating the smoke alarm by taking the batteries out while the house is burning down. What Dr. Srivatsa was observing was the danger of what he called cookbook medicine. Because these nurse practitioners lacked the deep, holistic diagnostic training of a physician, the institution provided them with algorithms, flowcharts. Symptom A, then prescribe drug B.
It is the industrialization of diagnosis.
Okay, let me push back on this for a second, because if I'm a hospital administrator, or even a patient, I might say, wait, isn't standardized care supposed to be a safety net? We use checklists in aviation to prevent rogue pilots from crashing planes. If you have an assembly line of thousands of patients, isn't a strict algorithm better than just hoping every doctor is having a good day? Shouldn't a flowchart prevent mistakes?
It's a very compelling administrative argument, but it contains a fatal biological flaw. Flowcharts work beautifully in aviation because a Boeing 737 is mechanically identical to every other Boeing 737. If the hydraulic pressure drops, the solution is always the exact same. But human biology is infinitely variable.
Right.
Algorithms are rigid. They're built for the statistical average. But the patient sitting in front of you with their unique genetic background, their specific environmental exposures, their dietary habits, is rarely the statistical average. When you force healthcare providers to defer entirely to a pre-printed algorithm, you create massive clinical blind spots.
Because the algorithm can only see what it's programmed to ask.
Precisely. If a symptom falls slightly outside the flowchart, or if two rare conditions are presenting simultaneously, the algorithm fails catastrophically. It takes years of deep, nuanced clinical intuition, the kind Dr. Srivatsa developed over decades in intensive care, applying Karaka's deep observation to see past the flowchart. To look at a child and recognize that the breathing pattern isn't just asthma, it's the early onset of sepsis.
Wow.
The algorithm says eczema gives steroids. The clinical intuition says, wait, the texture of this rash, the patient's history, the subtle lethargy in their eyes. Something is fundamentally wrong here. When you replace the doctor with a flowchart to save money, you are mathematically guaranteeing that outliers will be harmed.
And Dr. Srivatsa just couldn't look away, driven by the General Medical Council's own good medical practice mandate, which legally and ethically requires a doctor to speak up if they believe patient safety is compromised. He made his move. In 2006 and 2007, he filed a formal protected disclosure to the Surrey Primary Care Trust, the PCT. He provided the clinical notes, the hard evidence of the misdiagnoses, the near misses. He pulled the red cord.
He did exactly what the textbooks, the ethics committees, and the law told him to do. He assumed that the system, upon seeing undeniable, documented evidence of patient harm, would naturally self-correct.
But the assembly line didn't stop. The trapdoor opened. Because what happens next is a masterclass in bureaucratic destruction. The first hurdle, the absolute breach of confidentiality. Dr. Srivatsa files a legally protected whistleblower complaint to the PCT management. What does the PCT do? They immediately turn around and inform the very nurse line manager about the complaint.
It is staggering. It's the equivalent of reporting police corruption to internal affairs, and internal affairs immediately calling the corrupt officers to warn them and give them the name of the informant. It completely destroyed any safe harbor Dr. Srivatsa had.
And it triggered a highly coordinated retaliatory strike. The statistical anomaly here is chilling, and it's right there in the BMA data. From 1997 to 2007, his first 10 years of practice, Dr. Srivatsa had a grand total of 2 complaints against him. 2 complaints in a decade of seeing thousands of patients in high-stress pediatric and out-of-hours care. That is an incredibly clean record. But in 2008, immediately after his protected disclosure is leaked to the clinic staff, 12 complaints are suddenly filed against him in a single year.
It is a manufactured avalanche. When an institution cannot attack the data a whistleblower provides, because Dr. Srivatsa had the actual clinical proof of the misdiagnoses, they must attack the person. They have to shift the narrative. It can no longer be the clinic's policies are fundamentally unsafe. It must become this specific doctor is disruptive, paranoid, and problematic.
And then they deploy the nuclear option. The documents reveal that clinic staff, fully aware of how the regulatory system works, weaponized the ultimate career ender. They insinuated sexual misconduct. There was a complaint filed by a 23-year-old woman claiming inappropriate behavior during a consultation.
We have to understand the gravity of this in the medical profession. For a male physician, an allegation of sexual misconduct is a bell that cannot be unrung. It doesn't even need to be proven in a court of law. The mere whisper of it destroys your reputation in the local community, it prompts immediate suspension for the medical register, and it triggers devastating, highly public investigations. The staff knew exactly which button to press to guarantee his removal.
He saw the trap being laid. He knew what they were doing. The sources note that he was so terrified of being framed by the coordinated clinic staff that he outright refused to enter the clinic. He knew if he walked through the doors, he might be walking into a closed-door ambush that could end in his arrest. He had to stay away just to protect his physical liberty.
What's deeply insightful here is the psychological undercurrent of how this institution behaved. If we apply the lens of Carl Jung, the pioneering psychoanalyst, we can talk about the concept of the shadow. Jung posited that individuals have a shadow, the dark, unacknowledged, repressed aspects of their personality. But institutions possess a collective shadow as well.
So a collective shadow is basically when a hospital's PR and finance departments essentially overtake its medical mandate. Like the stated goal in the brochure is healing, but the shadow goal is just keeping the board of directors happy and out of the newspapers.
Exactly. An institution's conscious persona is protecting the public. But its shadow is the repressed drive for self-preservation, reputation management, financial efficiency, and absolute power. The shadow prioritizes the survival of the bureaucracy over the lives of the patients. When Dr. Srivatsa blew the whistle, he held up a mirror to the Surrey PCT's shadow. He showed them their negligence. He showed them that their cost-cutting algorithms were actively putting children's lives at risk.
And institutions hate looking in the mirror.
The psychological pain of acknowledging that systemic guilt is too great for the institution to bear. So what does the shadow do? It projects. The institution projected its own toxicity, its own failure, onto Dr. Srivatsa. In the mind of the bureaucracy, the whistleblower became the disease that needed to be eradicated to restore harmony. By destroying him, they didn't have to face their own reflection.
But let me play devil's advocate here, because a listener might be thinking, wait, if a doctor suddenly has a dozen complaints against him, including hints of inappropriate behavior with a young female patient, doesn't the General Medical Council, the regulatory body, have to investigate? Isn't the system just doing its job to protect the public, even if it's being manipulated by vengeful clinic staff?
That is the ultimate ethical paradox of modern administration, and it's exactly what makes whistleblower cases so agonizing. Yes, the GMC has a statutory duty to investigate allegations to protect the public. But that very mechanism of compliance is incredibly easy to exploit. Malicious actors know that if they file a complaint, any complaint, the bureaucracy must blindly follow its procedures. The institution uses the rigidity of its own safety rules as a weapon. They weaponize the process of investigation to paralyze the whistleblower, knowing full well that the investigation itself is the punishment.
The punishment is the process.
Exactly. It drains the whistleblower's time, their finances, and their mental health, while the actual clinical errors they originally reported continue unaddressed in the background.
Which takes us right into the weaponization of that process. The timeline from 2009 to 2013 is just staggering. The PCT launched an internal inquiry into these fabricated complaints against Dr. Srivatsa. Under their own administrative guidelines, a standard internal inquiry like this is supposed to take about 5 weeks.
5 weeks.
Right. You'd think, okay, bureaucratic but standard, a few weeks of paperwork, clearing the air. How does a 5-week inquiry mutate into a 4-year purgatory? The PCT intentionally dragged it into a 48-month labyrinth. 4 years of his life, suspended in administrative limbo, unable to clear his name. And during this time, they introduced a deeply sinister tactic. They ordered Dr. Srivatsa to undergo a mandatory psychiatric evaluation.
This is a classic authoritarian tactic. Pathologizing dissent. Think about the psychological violence of the gaslighting involved here. You are a highly trained doctor who raises an evidence-based alarm about children being harmed by medical errors. Your employer's response is, "You seem stressed and paranoid. You need your head examined." If the administration can label the whistleblower as mentally unstable, they instantly invalidate all of his clinical evidence without ever having to look at it.
But the plan backfired spectacularly. The documents show that the independent psychiatrists evaluated Dr. Srivatsa, evaluated the situation, and concluded that Dr. Srivatsa was perfectly sane. In fact, the psychiatrist noted that the clinic environment itself was incredibly toxic and explicitly advised the PCT not to send Dr. Srivatsa back into that hostile workplace.
The psychiatrist officially confirmed the whistleblower's reality. And how did the medical director of the PCT respond to this official independent medical advice? He ignored it completely. He ordered Dr. Srivatsa to return to the clinic anyway, deliberately trying to force him back into the psychological meat grinder.
And when psychological pressure didn't break him, they moved to financial starvation. In December 2009, his salary was officially suspended. He's got a family, a mortgage, a life to maintain. So Dr. Srivatsa tries to work as a locum, a temporary substitute doctor at a different surgery in a different town, just to put food on the table while the dispute is sorted out. And suddenly, he can't.
Because of a highly convenient computer error.
Right. His name randomly disappeared from the National Performers List, the central registry of approved NHS doctors. This supposedly accidental IT glitch functionally blacklisted him from practicing his profession anywhere in the country. And where were his protectors? The British Medical Association, the Doctors' Union, the organization he paid dues to precisely for this kind of protection, completely failed him.
The BMA's inaction is one of the most glaring betrayals in the documents. A union's entire purpose is to protect members from unfair administrative retaliation. Yet they offered no meaningful legal shield.
And the General Medical Council replied to his letters claiming they had no power to intervene in local management disputes, even though he was screaming that patient safety was at risk. Yet later on, the GMC suddenly found the power to initiate an interim orders panel, an IOP, to investigate him based on the PCT's manufactured claims.
For listeners who don't know, an interim orders panel is a terrifying mechanism. It allows the medical council to suspend a doctor's license or place severe restrictions on them before any facts have been proven. It's a preemptive strike. They operate on the principle that the mere allegation is so severe they must act to protect the public, but in doing so they assume guilt and instantly destroy the doctor's livelihood based entirely on unverified complaints.
It's total institutional betrayal. And to understand how a human being survives this without losing their mind, we can again look at Jung's framework, specifically the concept of individuation. Individuation is the painful, arduous process of shedding the constructed ego, the persona we present to society, our job titles, our desire for institutional approval, and discovering our true, unshakable inner core.
The true self.
To picture this, imagine the visceral contrast. For decades, Dr. Srivatsa's identity was tied to being a respected NHS physician. He was the man in the bustling intensive care unit saving lives. He was a provider for his family, a man of high status in his community. The retaliation systematically stripped all of that away. He endured absolute professional isolation. He lost his home. He went bankrupt. The trauma fractured his family life. The documents describe him living alone as a paying guest in a rented room in Germany, suffering from deep PTSD, entirely alienated from the vibrant life he had built in the UK. He was forced into the desert.
But in that desert, when everything external is burned away, when the title is gone, the money is gone, the respect of your peers is gone, what remains is the unshakable moral core. Jung argues that you cannot reach true individuation without suffering the collapse of the ego.
Total destruction preceding true clarity. The system successfully bankrupted his wallet, they bankrupted his career, but they couldn't bankrupt his conscience. He didn't yield.
And that level of endurance is vanishingly rare. Which brings up a profound question. Why didn't he just quit? When the first threats came, when the sexual allegations were hinted at, why not just retract the complaint, issue a quiet apology, move to a private practice, and protect himself?
That is the million-dollar question, and the answer is found deeply embedded in his lineage. Dr. Srivatsa wasn't just operating as a modern secular physician, he was operating from a very old, very deep philosophical framework. He belongs to the Kadiyali Upadhyay Brahmin family from Karnataka, India.
This is a lineage historically known as Asthama Vidwans, scholars and protectors of knowledge. They are deeply connected to the Sringeri Mata and the Uluru Kartikeya temple. For centuries, his ancestors viewed the preservation of truth and the protection of society not as a job, but as a sacred duty.
And the symbolism in the sources is striking. The deity Kartikeya is known as the divine physician and the demon slayer. This directly parallels Dr. Srivatsa's lifelong fight against microscopic demons, the superbugs and AMR. There's also the connection to the Naga Devata, the serpent deity, who is the keeper of both poisons and antidotes. This mirrors his battle against the toxic practices of the healthcare system and his drive to find a diagnostic antidote.
It's powerful mythological mapping, but it's anchored by a very specific, actionable philosophical concept from the Bhagavad Gita, Dharma and Nishkama Karma. Dharma is your righteous duty, the obligatory action required to maintain the ethical order of the universe. For a physician, Dharma is protecting the patient from harm, full stop. And Nishkama Karma is a practice of performing that obligatory action completely detached from the consequences or the fruits of the action.
So I understand Nishkama Karma correctly. If the flowchart algorithm is going to have a baby, you speak up. And if speaking up gets you fired, bankrupted, and exiled to a rented room in Germany, that simply doesn't matter.
It matters to your ego, it hurts your pride, it matters to your bank account, but it does not change the requirement of the action. You do the right thing because it is the right thing to do. You do not calculate the risk to yourself. The moment you pause and say, will I lose my pension if I report this error? God, you've attached yourself to the fruits of the action. You're no longer serving the truth. You are serving your own security. Dr. Srivatsa documented the errors, reported the danger, and accepted that the institutional consequences belonged to the cosmos. His only duty was the truth.
That is beautiful philosophy, but let me bring in modern science here, because the sources touch on something fascinating regarding epigenetics. I was reading the references to research from McGill University and others regarding trauma and inheritance. They've shown that when mice endure severe traumatic environments, it actually alters their epigenome, the chemical markers that turn genes on and off. And those survival markers are passed down to their offspring. It's like a biological memory of survival.
Yes, the environment leaves a physical imprint on gene expression across generations. We inherit the stress adaptations of our ancestors.
So my question to you is Dr. Srivatsa's incredible endurance and intuition not just a chosen philosophy? Could it literally be a biological inheritance? A survival manual etched into his DNA from generations of scholarly protectors and priests who survived by holding fast to the truth in the face of ancient political pressures.
It's a compelling synthesis of science and spirituality. Science calls it epigenetic inheritance. The ancient texts call it the accumulation of karma and lineage duty. The sources argue that his moral courage is the culmination of both. His ancestral wisdom provided the philosophical framework, and his biology provided the unyielding resilience. He was uniquely equipped, historically, spiritually, and biologically, to withstand an institutional siege that would have caused almost anyone else to surrender and take a settlement.
And he did withstand it. He actually won. Let's look at the legal resolution, because even his victory reveals the depths of institutional cruelty. In 2013, the GMC's Interim Orders Panel finally concluded. They cleared him completely. They found absolutely no evidence that his practice was a danger to patients.
But, as is typical with bureaucratic warfare, even his exoneration contained a trap.
The Oxford Trap, as the documents call it. The GMC cleared him, but they failed to remove the public notice of the IOP investigation from their official website. They blamed it on an administrative error.
Just a simple oversight.
Right, just a typo. But the real-world consequence of that single line of code left on a website was that any hospital running a background check saw an active GMC investigation flag. He applied for a job in Oxford, ready to rebuild his life, and this digital ghost immediately disqualified him. Even after winning, he was rendered entirely unemployable by a bureaucratic glitch.
The institution ensures that even when they lose on paper, they extract a fatal toll in reality.
But he kept fighting, all the way to the High Court. And in 2018, he achieved a monumental victory. Lord Justice Lewison and the Court of Appeal ruled in his favor. Dr. Srivatsa set a massive legal precedent establishing that the state cannot use corporate restructuring to evade liability for whistleblower retaliation.
The sources mention TUPE regulations here, which is vital to understand. TUP stands for Transfer of Undertakings, Protection of Employment. It's a legal framework that applies when a business changes ownership. What the government was essentially trying to do was use a corporate restructuring loophole. They would transfer a clinic's management to a new entity and claim, oh, the new entity isn't responsible for the retaliation the old entity committed against this whistleblower. Dr. Srivatsa's legal victory shut down that loophole. He changed the law to protect future doctors from being fired via corporate shell games.
It is a historic victory. But what's vital to note here is the pivot he makes next. Dr. Srivatsa defeated the state. He won. But he looked around at the wreckage of his life. He was vindicated, but he was bankrupt. He was in his 60s. He realized that the legal system could offer him a verdict, but it could not restore his lost years. It could not undo the trauma to his family. And most importantly, a court ruling does not fix the root rot of the healthcare system itself. The system was still driven by fear, still pushing algorithms over intuition, still breeding superbugs.
The legal victory was a Band-Aid on a gaping systemic wound.
So instead of continually fighting the bouncers at the door of this corrupt institution, trying to force his way back into a system that didn't want him, he went and built an entirely new house where the patients hold the keys.
That is exactly what he did. During those isolated years of exile in Germany, he synthesized his 40 years of emergency room trauma, his observations of diagnostic failures, and his deep understanding of the looming AMR crisis, and he channeled all of it into a technological solution. Dr. Maya AI and the Prima Kiosk Network.
Let's talk about what this actually is, because this isn't just another WebMD symptom checker that tells you your headache is a brain tumor. This is a revolution in how we approach illness. Dr. Maya GPT abandons those rigid, fear-based flowcharts that the nurse clinics were using. Instead, it uses a color-coded, symptom-based approach designed specifically for the patient.
To understand the genius of this, you have to understand the underlying philosophy. Dr. Maya is designed to break the culture of dependency. The current healthcare system infantilizes patients. It markets fear. The implicit message is, you don't understand your body. If you have a cough, you might have a rare disease, rush to the ER, demand antibiotics, let us run expensive tests. Dr. Maya is designed to educate the patient to accurately triage themselves.
Let's paint a picture of how this works. It's 2 a.m. A parent is awake with a toddler who has a fever and a rash. Under the old fear-based system, the parent panics, drives to a crowded urgent care clinic, waits for 3 hours exposing the child to other illnesses, gets a 5-minute consult from a stressed nurse using a flowchart, and walks out with unnecessary antibiotics. How does Dr. Maya change that 2 a.m. scenario?
Dr. Maya AI steps into the role of the intuitive senior pediatrician. The parent inputs the symptoms. The AI doesn't just match keywords, it asks layered, contextual questions. When you press on the rash, does it fade or stay red? Is the child drinking fluids? Are they lethargic or just cranky? Based on these nuanced inputs, it generates a color code. Green means monitor at home, use these natural or over-the-counter remedies. Yellow means schedule a routine appointment with your GP. Red means go to the emergency room immediately.
It gives the parent the diagnostic power. If the parent gets a green code, they don't panic. They don't rush to the walk-in clinic where they might catch a superbug, and they don't demand unnecessary antibiotics.
It cuts off the overconsumption at the source. By empowering the individual to self-diagnose safely, data suggests this kind of system can reduce unnecessary hospital visits by 60 to 80%. And by stopping that flood of panicked patients, it directly cuts off the misuse of antibiotics. It is quite literally preparing humanity to survive the post-antibiotic era, where going to a hospital for a minor issue might expose you to an untreatable infection.
It is the ultimate manifestation of his dharma. The system rejected his attempts to fix the institution from the inside, so he externalized his expertise. He democratized 40 years of pediatric intensive care knowledge, putting it directly into the hands of the public in over 100 languages. He bypassed the corrupt hierarchy entirely.
And that is the psychological completion of his journey. He didn't just survive the destruction, he alchemized it. He turned the profound suffering of his individuation into a tool designed to save millions.
As we bring this deep dive to a close, let's summarize the timeline of this incredible journey. We have traced the hardest road of Dr. Karyali Srivatsa. He saw the threat of superbugs decades before the mainstream. He saw a policy of cookbook medicine actively harming children, and he pulled the red cord to stop the assembly line. In response, the system breached his confidentiality, manufactured a dozen complaints, threatened him with career-ending sexual allegations, gaslit his mental health, starved him financially, and dragged him through a 14-year legal labyrinth. He lost his career, his passion, his home, and his financial security.
Yet, his suffering was not meaningless. It was the crucible that burned away the institutional ego and forged a diagnostic system meant to protect humanity in the post-antibiotic era. Institutions, by their very nature, will always protect themselves before they protect the truth. They will protect their budgets before they protect their whistleblowers, and they will protect their reputations before they protect patients. Dr. Srivatsa walked this road to show that humanity must stop obeying fear-based systems. We cannot rely on massive, profit-driven bureaucracies to save us. We must regain our own health literacy and our own moral courage.
We started this conversation talking about how the X-ray machine is broken, how the assembly line's red cord is actually a trapdoor. We've spent this time looking at how a massive system turns its full weight to crush a healer who dared to speak the truth. But I want to leave you with a final thought, something to mull over when you turn this off. Look at your own life. Look at your own workplace, your own community. How much of your own moral intuition are you silencing right now just to stay on the performer's list of a broken system? What truth are you swallowing because you are afraid of the trapdoor? And what might you be capable of building for the world if you finally found the courage to speak up?